Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're talking about the 2026 Senate elections, obviously for the US Senate, and I'm looking at today's video with the idea of what is the Democrats' best realistic scenario that they can get in 2026. Now I am going to be doing another video as well in the coming days on the Republicans' best case scenario, so make sure to check that one out as well. But today's video is going to focus on what the Democrats' best case scenario is. So right now, the current Senate map that I have for 2026 currently has the Republicans favored to win about 51 Senate seats. Democrats currently favored to win 45, with 4 Senate seats I'm currently considering as toss-up or as battlegrounds. These are the Senate seats in Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, and Maine. So for today's video, I'm going to go through the 4 battleground seats that I think Democrats could potentially be in play of winning. And then I'm also, after I do those, going to talk about the other seats that are in the lean and likely category and talk about how Democrats could try and expand the Senate map a little bit in 2026. First, I'm going to start with the state of Maine, because Maine could perhaps be the most interesting Senate race in 2026. Maine, this seat is currently held by Republican incumbent Susan Collins. Now, Susan Collins is the only Republican senator representing a state that former Vice President Kamala Harris won in the 2024 presidential election. So obviously, this is making her a top target of the national and Maine Democrats in this race. It also should be worth noting, Collins has not officially declared that she's running again, but she has expressed interest in doing so. What's interesting right now is the Democrats, they have a lot of Democratic candidates running, but all eyes are on the governor of Maine, Janet Mills, who many are viewing as the strongest possible candidate to challenge Susan Collins in this Maine Senate race for 2026. She's kind of the candidate that everyone's waiting on for the decision to be made. Now, her Senate race, when she was last up in 2020, she won by 8.6%. But it should be worth noting, though, also, when you go through the actual numbers, on the first round of voting, Susan Collins got 50.98% of the vote. The Democrat, Sarah Gideon, got 42.39% of the vote. And if you're a casual observer of elections and such, you may be wondering, well, that number seems a little bit odd. And what's interesting about Maine is Maine utilizes a system of elections called ranked choice voting, which is the winning candidate must break 50% of the vote on the first round, the initial vote, or it will go to the ranked choice voting process, and then the one candidate will have to break 50%. Now, in this situation, Susan Collins broke 50% on the first round, but she did only get 50.98% of the vote, where the Democrat, Sarah Gideon, got 42.39%. An independent candidate, Lisa Savage, got 4.95%. Another independent, Max Lynn, got 1.65%. So that's roughly over 6 points or so that was also independent vote. If it did go to ranked choice voting, Susan Collins obviously would have enough support to win, so it would not need to be happening. But I would bet a lot of that third-party vote likely would have gone to Sarah Gideon, making that 8-point margin of victory that Susan Collins got probably a lot smaller heading into the election. So that's important to watch for 2026 as we're talking about this Senate race. Now, obviously, a big determining factor for 2026 is going to be the election environment that Democrats and Republicans are running in for 2026. For now, we don't really know how it's going to be, but we do know the Democrats are likely to have an advantage, and that could be anywhere from 2 to 5 points or so, maybe even more depending on the type of night Democrats have. But Democrats should be favored in this election environment. Now, back in 2024, Kamala Harris won the state of Maine against Donald Trump by 6.9%, though the Republican 2nd District voted for Trump by 9 points. As for the Senate race, this is going to be very close, but I do think if it's Susan Collins versus Janet Mills, especially in the Democrats' best case scenario, Maine certainly, seeing as it is already a Democratic state at the presidential level, certainly could narrowly go for the Democrats, flipping one Republican Senate seat towards the Democratic direction. So Maine will be a very important one to watch for 2026. The next Senate seat that's the most obvious pickup for 2024 is the state of North Carolina. North Carolina, this seat is currently held by the Republican Senator Thom Tillis. He is retiring, not seeking another term, and the Democrats have landed an absolute all-star recruit in the former governor of the state of North Carolina, Roy Cooper. This is literally perhaps the Democrats' best candidate recruit for all of 2026, and Roy Cooper. He presents the Democrats a rare opportunity in the usual Republican-leaning swing state of North Carolina at being able to potentially win this race. Now, the Republicans are running former chair of the Republican National Committee, Michael Whatley, who already has the endorsement of President Trump, and Laura Trump as well, and Senators John Thune and Tim Scott. So Whatley's already consolidated support as well. So the Democratic and Republican primaries here are essentially set, and now it's on to the general. Where thus far, there hasn't been a ton of polls, but the polls that have been taken thus far show Roy Cooper starting out with a bit of an early lead in this race. Still a lot of undecided vote left. Roy Cooper is more well known in the state of North Carolina than Michael Whatley is, so this is going to be a very close race that's going to go down to the wire. But in the Democrats' best case scenario here, it certainly would not be unrealistic at all to see North Carolina ending up in the lean Democratic category for Roy Cooper. This puts the Democrats up to 47 Senate seats. This would be the Democrats flipping 2 Republican seats from 2024 to 2026 in this map. Now we have 2 other toss-up seats that are currently held by Democrats. First, we're going to go to the state of Georgia. Georgia, this Senate seat is held by the Democratic incumbent U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff. Now, Ossoff won a very close election back in 2020. And in this one, this was part of that election year where Joe Biden narrowly won the presidency. Both Georgia's Senate races did not go over 50% on the initial ballot, so they had to go to a runoff. So on election day, David Perdue was leading over Jon Ossoff 49.73 to 47.95. Perdue was only about a few thousand votes away from actually breaking that 50% threshold and defeating Ossoff. But that did not happen, so they went to a runoff election. This is a 2-round system where the top 2 candidates advance and one candidate breaks 50%. And in that, Ossoff and the Democrats were more motivated to get out and vote. Ossoff ended up winning 50.6% to Perdue 49.39%. President Trump, however, did narrowly win back Georgia in 2024. So this is going to be a seat Republicans are targeting to try and win back. However, one good news for Democrats and for Jon Ossoff is the Republicans' top-tier best recruit, and Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, officially announced he would not be running for Senate. He has now endorsed Republican Derek Dooley in this race. So the Republicans are without their top contender. Now, U.S. Representative Buddy Carter, Mike Collins, and the aforementioned Derek Dooley are all running. We're going to have to wait and see how this Republican primary plays out. And thus far, Derek Dooley has been endorsed by Kemp. President Trump has not weighed in on an endorsement in this race as of yet. The early polling shows a tight race thus far with a lot of undecided vote, though Mike Collins does seem to be the early leader at this current point in time. The early polling as well, it's been a very narrow lead for Jon Ossoff in most cases, but it's been a very consistent one, even in Republican polls, that Jon Ossoff starts out with an early lead in this race, though it does seem that Mike Collins is giving Ossoff the hardest fight of the Republicans running. I actually think, then compared to some other predictors, that I think Georgia's Senate race is going to be closer than many are having it, but I do think Jon Ossoff is still going to ultimately end up winning this Senate race in Georgia, holding on and surviving another 6 years. And again, this is the Democrats' best case scenario, so Georgia would obviously go blue in that scenario, but I do think Ossoff right now is favored to win pretty much regardless. Now we can go to the state of Michigan, where Michigan, this is a wide open race. This is going to be Democratic incumbent Senator Gary Peters. He is retiring. He's not seeking another term, or he's not seeking a third term. And what's interesting about this one is this is kind of the flip of some other races. In this one, the Republican primary is already pretty much set, where the Republican Mike Rogers, the nominee for Senate in 2024, is the only major Republican running, and he already has the endorsement of President Trump and 3 of the top U.S. senators in the United States. Now, for the Republicans. Now, on the Democratic side, it's a wide open primary. U.S. Representative Haley Stevens, State Senator Malik McMorrow, and Abdul Al-Sayed, the former Wayne County Health Director, are the 3 leading Democrats at this current point in time in the race. So it is a really tough fight going on in this Democratic primary, where the early polling thus far shows Haley Stevens leading only by about 2 points in the National Republican Senatorial Committee poll. Whereas in the Global Strategy Group poll, which is a Democratic poll sponsored by Mallory McMorrow, Stevens is up by about 4 points, with a lot of undecided vote left. So this Democratic primary is going to be very competitive, and we'll have to wait and see how that all ends up going. For the general, it's going to be a very close race. Stevens versus Rogers shows Stevens leading by about 2 points or so in the most recent polls, though it is very close. Whereas Abdul Al-Sayed versus Rogers, Rogers is actually leading very narrowly in that matchup. And McMorrow versus Rogers, it's a bit of a split between the 2 polls. Some have Rogers leading, some have McMorrow leading. So this is going to be a very close race. Republicans certainly could win it, but in the Democrats' best case scenario, I think we see Michigan narrowly go for the Democrats. So in the Democrats' best case scenario, I think we could see Democrats hold on to their 2 seats in Georgia and Michigan, and then pick up the Republican-held seats in North Carolina and Maine. I think this is kind of the ceiling for what the Democrats could do. Now, in the Democrats' best case scenario, where basically it's a wave election and everything kind of goes their way, there are a few other seats that Democrats are going to want to be targeting. The first among them is going to be the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio, this is currently held by Republican incumbent Senator Jon Husted, who he is appointed to fill the remainder of the term of Vice President J.D. Vance, who previously held this seat. And Husted will be the Republican candidate again in this general election. Now, the Democrats, for their part, have landed former U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown to run for this race again. So they have landed an absolute A-plus tier recruit for this race. So much so that when this race started out in the likely Republican category, now this race is down to lean or even tilt Republican in most of the rankings. Now, the early polling actually shows Jon Husted leading by more than 5 points in both the Bowling Green State poll from February and the Emerson College poll from August. So it does show that Husted is starting out with a stronger lead against Brown than the other Republican Bernie Moreno, who faced off against Brown in 2024, previously had. So that is good news for Husted and the Republicans. But Sherrod Brown also, in that Senate race against Moreno, just lost by 3.6%, under 5 points, a very close matchup. And back in 2018, Ohio did go for Sherrod Brown by 6.8%. In the Democrats' absolute best case scenario, it's not impossible to see Ohio falling into the tilt Democratic category for Sherrod Brown. But Ohio has moved a lot to the Republican direction, and given how the state has voted for Donald Trump 3 times in a row by more than 5 points every single time, I think even in the Democrats' best case scenario, we're probably going to see Ohio under the 5% mark, maybe in between 1 and 5, but I think Ohio remains on the Republican side. But Democrats, if everything broke their way, it is technically mathematically possible for Sherrod Brown to pull out a win there, especially if everything breaks for the Democrats. That, I think, is the Democrats' best pickup opportunity. Democrats have now, in their best case scenario, would also like to try and win Iowa, but now that Joni Ernst is not running, I think the Democrats' chances there, at the Senate level at least, are going to be a lot tougher. Nebraska with Dan Osborne, the independent, that is another state Democrats are targeting, but now that the Republican Deb Fischer, who only won by about 7 points in 2024, Republicans know who Dan Osborne is. They know it's going to be a very tough fight and are going to probably take him a lot more seriously as a candidate. So I think Republicans will be a little bit more prepared for that fight. I still think it's going to be competitive, but I think Republicans are going to be relatively in good shape there. The two likely Republican seats that I'm actually watching for the Democrats to try and make a play at are Alaska and Texas. First, I'm going to start with Alaska because this is a very interesting special case here. The Republican incumbent Dan Sullivan is eligible to run for re-election, and I have not heard anything thus far suggesting that he could be vulnerable or that he has poor approval ratings. The biggest reason that this race could be competitive is that former U.S. Representative Mary Peltola is reportedly considering running for this Senate race. Now, Peltola is one of the rare Democrats in Alaska that has won nationwide office most recently. Most recently, she won the U.S. House seat for Alaska in 2022 by 9.9% against Sarah Palin. Where back in 2020, it was held by the Republican Young, and then in 2024, Nick Begich, the Republican, narrowly defeated Mary Peltola by about 2 points in that race. So it ended up being a very, very close one in the runoff election, where Begich won 51.3 to 48.7 when everything was said and done. So Peltola, for a Democrat in Alaska, is one of the best candidates out there that the Democrats could run. Now, Sullivan did win his race by 12.7% back in 2020, and if Peltola were to enter, I expect this race will be a lot closer. The early hypothetical polling for this race, one poll from Alaska Survey Research, the most recent poll from the end of July and beginning of August, showed Sullivan leading over Peltola by about 5 points, with 11% still undecided. She gets up to about 42% of the vote. Data for Progress, which is a Democratic sponsored polling firm, voted or has Dan Sullivan leading over Peltola 46 to 45%, with 4% undecided. Where Alaska Survey Research back in 2023 had Peltola up 44 to 41, still though a lot of undecided vote. The biggest problem for this race here is for Peltola to win, she's going to have to get a very high percentage of the vote. In the Senate race in 2022, in 2020, the Democrat got 41.19%. So Peltola in the early polling thus far already starts out better than what that Senate race ended up being. The question is, can Peltola win enough of those undecided voters in Alaska to get enough support to win this race? That's where the question is going to be. I think the Democrats' best case scenario, I think we see Alaska potentially fall under 5% and be a lean Republican win. I do think the Republican holds on there, but I certainly think Alaska could be a lot more competitive, which could have an effect. Even if Mary Peltola does not win the Senate race in the state, if Republicans have to spend money and resources in Alaska to hold on, that could hurt Republicans in other Senate seats, like in Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Maine, that Republicans need those resources and money to win. That could hurt them down ballot in those races if they have to defend Alaska. The last Senate seat I'm watching as a potential Democratic target is the state of Texas. Now, Texas obviously is a very Republican state based on the 2024 presidential results. It just voted for Donald Trump by 13.7%. But the Senate race in 2018 for Ted Cruz's Beto O'Rourke was only a 2.6% win for Cruz. So in the right election environment with an unpopular enough Republican candidate, Texas can have a close Senate race. And this is what the scenario basically relies on. For the Republican Senate seat, which is held by incumbent John Cornyn, to be competitive in Texas, it would need to be Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. He would need to win this Republican primary in advance to the general. That would be step one for the Democrats in making this a competitive race. Now, the good news for the Democrats is Paxton and Cornyn in the recent few weeks or so have been essentially neck and neck in this Republican primary, with still a lot of undecided vote left out there. But for a while, Ken Paxton has been leading by a pretty large number. Now, on the Democratic side, the Democrats do have Colin Allred, their nominee from 2024, running again, and State Representative James Talarico is expected to be announcing his bid any day now, even possibly, as of the time of recording this, September 9th, so even possibly tomorrow. So that could be a very big get for the Democrats in that race as well. Now the question is going to be, can the Democrats win with John Cornyn or Ken Paxton in the race? With John Cornyn running, the answer seems to essentially be no. Cornyn starts out with a much higher floor of support, and the Democrats don't really be able to keep up as much. In a new poll, which is sponsored by Colin Allred's campaign, so certainly take that with a grain of salt, Allred versus Paxton shows the very least. Allred starts out with a narrow lead and could potentially win. For Emerson College poll, which I'd put a lot more stock in than the Democratic internal poll, it's about a 5-point lead for Paxton over Allred, with 13% undecided. So in that one, I think Paxton would still win, but there's a lot more undecided vote and a chance for the Democrats to win that race than a lot of Republicans in Texas would certainly like. So for that one, that would have Texas falling into the lean Republican category. But I still think the Democrats' best case scenario, they get 49 Senate seats. Republicans are at 51. I have a very hard time envisioning the Democrats winning the Senate majority in 2026. But I think if they have everything go their way for 2026, they can get up to 49 Senate seats, and that could put them in a very good position to maybe win back the Senate in 2028, especially if they were to win back the White House. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going over the 2026 Senate elections, and today's video is a part 2 to my prior video I did just a little bit before this, where I did the Democrats' best case scenario for 2026, best realistic scenario. For this one, I'm doing the Republicans' best case scenario for the 2026 Senate map. So on that one, just a little bit of a spoiler, I got the Democrats up to 49 Senate seats, Republicans at 51, based on the current Senate map rankings that I currently have, with the Democrats possibly being in contention in Ohio, Texas, and Alaska in the right election environment and circumstances. Now for the Republicans don't have as many targets on the Senate map to expand beyond the ones that are already in contention. But the good news for the Republicans is all 4 battleground states that are up in 2026 could conceivably be won by the Republicans, as President Trump did win 3 out of the 4 of them in 2024's presidential election. So first, I'm going to start with the Senate race in the state of Maine. This is going to be a Republican U.S. Senator Susan Collins, who won a very close election in 2020, but she was able to win despite a lot of the polling showing her down heading into Election Day. Now, Susan Collins does have the mantle of being the only Republican U.S. Senator representing a seat currently held in a state that Kamala Harris won in the 2024 presidential election. So she is going to be a very top target of national Democrats, certainly for that reason. Now, the good news for Collins thus far is Democrats do have a lot of candidates running, but the most high-profile Democrat in the state, Janet Mills, has not yet officially announced if she is running for this race or not. I think Janet Mills not running for this race would be a big break for Susan Collins, though I do think Graham Plattner could potentially make this race very competitive as well. I think no matter which Democrat ends up running, this will be a competitive race. But I do think Susan Collins showed in 2020 that she can win a very tough race in a tough election environment like 2020 ended up being. Just to show you the results here from 2020, Susan Collins got about 50.98% of the vote in her Senate race, where on the same time in 2020, the presidential level, Donald Trump was only able to get 44% of the vote against Joe Biden. So Collins was able to outperform Trump by about 7 points on the Republican side of things. So I do think in the Republicans' best case scenario, I think Susan Collins holds on and wins this Senate race. Though I do think it's going to fall under 5 points this time. I think it will be more competitive than it was in 2020. I do think Susan Collins can hold on and win. Now that gets the Republicans up to 52. The next pickup opportunity for the Republicans, for me, starts in the state of Michigan. Now, Michigan is going to be one to watch for the Republicans, as President Trump just won the state in 2024 by 1.4% against Kamala Harris. The Senate race was even closer, where the Democrat Elisa Slotkin defeated the Republican Mike Rogers by 0.34% in a very close race. Now, the Republicans do have Mike Rogers running again in the Senate race. So the Republican primary on the Senate side of things is essentially over. We know Mike Rogers is going to be the Republican nominee, and Rogers already has the endorsement of President Trump and several U.S. senators. Now, the good news for the Republicans in this race is the Democratic primary is completely wide open between Haley Stevens, Mallory McMorrow, and Abdul El-Sayed. The early polling has shown a very tight race, and this is going to be one that's bitterly fought to the end. And typically in elections, when there are primaries that are very hard fought and very close, that can sometimes hurt the party in the general election, as a lot of the candidates that lose in the primary supporters could be very dissatisfied with how the primary turned out, and some of them may just decide to stay home. It doesn't always work out that way, but sometimes in elections that does happen. That could give the Republicans a little bit of a chance in this race at winning it. It's currently a toss-up by all the political prediction rankings. Haley Stevens, the Democrat, has led Mike Rogers in 2 of the 3 polls thus far, though not by a very large margin in those. Whereas Abdul El-Sayed versus Mike Rogers and Mallory McMorrow versus Mike Rogers, Rogers seems to be polling better against those 2 candidates. So the Republicans' best case scenario would probably involve Abdul El-Sayed or Mallory McMorrow winning the Democratic primary, advancing to the general, and then Mike Rogers, even without President Trump at the top of the ticket, getting a little bit lucky and winning the state of Michigan probably by under 1 point. Seeing as the election was just under 1 point in 2024, without President Trump to help drive out voter turnout, it's going to be a tougher time for Rogers in all likelihood, but against potentially a weaker Democratic candidate that could give Rogers a bit of an advantage. So thus far, with the Republicans' best case scenario, winning Maine and Michigan, that gets the GOP up to 53 seats. That's the current number they already hold. Now we're going to go into the state of North Carolina, where North Carolina, this seat is currently held by Republican incumbent Thom Tillis. Now, Thom Tillis is not running again for a 3rd term in North Carolina, and it is an open race. The good news for the Republicans is Michael Whatley, the former chair of the Republican National Committee, is running and essentially has cleared the Republican primary already, getting the endorsement of President Trump, President Trump's daughter-in-law Laura Trump, and U.S. Senators John Thune and Tim Scott. So essentially the Republican primary is over. Now, the bad news for the Republicans is that former governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, is running as the Democratic candidate and will be the Democratic nominee. Now, Roy Cooper has won in his history 2 very close, impressive governor's races in the state. First, in 2016, defeating Republican incumbent Pat McCrory by 0.22% in that very close race. Then in 2020, Cooper winning by 4.5% against the Republican Dan Forest. So the Republicans are certainly in for a very tough fight in North Carolina. The best thing the Republicans have going for them is that North Carolina, historically at the Senate level in recent years, has been more of a lean Republican state. Ted Budd won by 3.2% in 2022. In 2020, Thom Tillis won by 1.7%. 2016, before that, Richard Burr won by 5.7%. In 2014, Tillis defeated Democratic incumbent Hagan by 1.6%. Now, the Republicans have not faced a Democratic candidate as electorally strong as Roy Cooper in North Carolina in any of those Senate races, though with it also being without it also being consistent Republican, 3-point win for Trump in 2024, 1.3 in 2020, 2016, 3.7 for Trump. It's been close, but it has voted consistently red. That's the best thing the Republicans have going for them. In the GOP's best case scenario, I think North Carolina still falls under 1 point, but I think Michael Whatley could defeat Roy Cooper in this race in the GOP's best case scenario. That gets the Republicans a net gain of 1 Senate seat and holding North Carolina and Maine and then adding the state of Michigan. But it potentially does not end there. Next, we have the state of Georgia, where this seat is currently held by Democrat Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff won his Senate seat in 2020 on the same night when Joe Biden nearly won the state of Georgia. Ossoff won against David Perdue in the runoff election by 1.2%. Now, on election night, Perdue won technically against Ossoff 49.73 to 47.95. But in Georgia election law, you must break 50% of the vote to win the race. Neither candidate did it. They advanced to the runoff, and Ossoff ended up winning. Now, for this Senate race, the Republicans are desperately hoping to defeat Ossoff and flip the Senate seat back, especially as both Senate seats in Georgia are now held by Democrats. And Ossoff is going to be a very tough, formidable challenge for the GOP. Now, the Republicans do not have their top-tier recruit in Governor Brian Kemp running in this race, and that's certainly going to hurt the Republicans' chances at winning. However, thus far, Republicans with Mike Collins, Derek Dooley, and Buddy Carter in this Republican primary, the early polling shows that still, despite Ossoff leading, the Republicans do still have a chance at winning this race. Though not as good of a chance as when Brian Kemp was winning, where Kemp was leading in every single race against Ossoff, and Kemp getting towards the mid to high 40% or so, already on the precipice against an incumbent of breaking 50%. This time around, Jon Ossoff is the one starting out with the lead in these early races. And depending on the candidate, Ossoff already starts around 50%. For Ossoff versus Derek Dooley, Ossoff's leading by 5 points in the most recent poll. For Ossoff versus Mike Collins, though, only about a 1-point lead for Ossoff at around 45%, with still 8% undecided and 3% saying other. So based on the polling thus far, it seems Mike Collins has the best chance in the general election of the floors of support, though Ossoff versus Derek Dooley still has 14% undecided. So we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out. But in the Republicans' best case scenario for 2026, I think it would not be impossible to see the Republicans shock the Democrats and Jon Ossoff in Georgia and narrowly flip this seat to the Republican side. And if the Republicans were to do this, so they were able to win the 4 battleground seats for 2026, this would get the Republicans to 55 Senate seats, Democrats would be at 45. This would certainly be bucking the trend of how midterm elections usually go, where the off-year party does better than the party in power of the White House and of the government, but it is technically possible this could happen. So those are the 4 toss-up seats. Are there any areas the Democrats could potentially lose that they're expected to win now that Republicans could expand the map into? The only real target I see for the GOP in doing that is the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is an interesting situation because this is going to be a seat held by Democratic incumbent Jeanne Shaheen. Now, Jeanne Shaheen is not running for re-election to a 4th term, so it's an open race. However, U.S. Representative from the 1st District, Chris Pappas, is running and essentially has this Democratic primary completely on lock. He will be the Democratic candidate. Now, the Republicans thus far do have 2 Republicans running, and former Massachusetts Senator and 2014 Republican candidate for Senate in New Hampshire, Scott Brown, and State Senator Dan Innes as well. But a new name could potentially be entering, and former U.S. Senator from New Hampshire, John Edward Sununu. Now, we have not had any polling thus far between what a Scott Brown and John Sununu primary could look like, but seeing as both of them are former U.S. senators who are certainly capable of fundraising a lot of money, not only will that primary likely be very competitive, but that could lead to a competitive general election as well. So we'll have to wait and see how that all goes. Now, the newest poll from St. Anselm College showed in the Scott Brown versus Dan Innes primary, Scott Brown would certainly be the favorite to win that. But with Sununu potentially entering, we're going to have to reevaluate that and see how it goes. For the predictions right now, it's currently in the lean Democratic category across all major predictors. And the most recent poll from St. Anselm College in that same poll showed Chris Pappas with a pretty large lead over Scott Brown. Pappas gets up to 48%, Scott Brown 37%, 15% undecided. Now, obviously, Chris Pappas has a very large lead over Brown based on this poll. The good news for Scott Brown, though, is that there's still 15% undecided. So the math is there for Brown and the Republicans that if everything breaks their way, the Republicans still can win this Senate race. It's certainly going to be an uphill battle, though. That's why it's in the lean Democratic category and not in the toss-up category, because I think even if a lot of that undecided vote ends up going for Scott Brown, I think Chris Pappas still probably has enough support to narrowly win the election. Now, polling is one thing, but just looking at recent election results in New Hampshire, at the presidential race, it's actually been pretty close. In 2024, Kamala Harris only defeated Donald Trump here by 2.8%, and Trump was able to get up to 47.87% of the vote. In 2020, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by 7.4% in New Hampshire. Trump got 45.36% of the vote. Now, that's important to mention because if you look at the recent Senate races, they have not been particularly close. In 2022, Maggie Hassan defeated Don Bolduc by about 9 points, Bolduc only getting 44%. Whereas in 2020, Jeanne Shaheen won by 15.6%. Corky Mesner, the Republican, only got 40.99%. Now, this is an open race, and I do think that Scott Brown and John Sununu are both way better candidates than Corky Mesner and Don Bolduc were in 2020 and 2022. Though the Democrat, Chris Pappas running, has also himself put up some very formidable wins in New Hampshire's 1st district, which is usually competitive, though we've seen Chris Pappas in every single one of his elections win it by more than 5 points in each one of his runs, even though this district for a while has been listed as Republican +1, Republican +2, now currently listed at Democrat +2. So I think New Hampshire still starts out in the lean Democratic category for 2026, but if everything went the Republicans' way in 2026, it would not be impossible to see New Hampshire fall into the tilt Republican category. Though I think seeing New Hampshire still be in tilt Democratic category probably makes more sense. So New Hampshire is a race that could potentially be a sleeper, especially if a lot of those undecided votes break for the GOP, but is one that is probably a little bit of a pipe dream for the GOP at this point. But again, could potentially be in play if historical trends were completely going the opposite of how midterm elections usually go. As for the rest of the map, it's really tough for the GOP because New Mexico and Minnesota really aren't in play. But given the way the map is constructed, if the Republicans could win 55, 56 Senate seats on this map, they could essentially lock up the Senate majority for the next 10 years in the U.S. Senate without really too much of a problem. So this would be very big for the GOP if they could do this. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts and any other future video ideas you would like to see me go over. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're going over some important news in the 2026 Texas Senate race, where Democratic State Representative James Talarico is reportedly going to announce that he is running for this race. Now I am recording this the day before Talarico is expected to enter the race. I'm recording this on Monday, September 8th, but the information is pretty solid that Talarico is jumping in, so this video is going to serve as my Talarico is entering the Senate race video. Now this is very interesting news, though not very surprising news. James Talarico, who's been expressing interest in a potential run for a few months now, is going to officially enter the race on Tuesday. The state legislature has been considered a rising star in Texas, conducting dozens of national media interviews after he and his fellow Democrats left the state to hold up President Trump's led plan to redraw the congressional map in the state of Texas, including Talarico going on Joe Rogan's very popular podcast earlier in the spring as well. And you may remember, if you saw this clip, that Joe Rogan even said that Talarico should look at running for president in the future. That's how much he spoke of him in the way he was communicating in that podcast interview. So Talarico is certainly someone Democrats are looking to rally behind potentially for the 2026 Senate race. Now this quickly is getting very interesting for Texas in 2026, and I'll explain why. This Senate race already has a very competitive primary underway on the Republican side. Republican U.S. Senator John Cornyn is up for re-election, but he's facing a very formidable primary challenge from the Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Now, John Cornyn has faced a lot of criticism in the last few years or so, especially by Ken Paxton, of being called a rhino, a Republican in name only, and someone that has not been loyal to President Trump. Now, for Trump's part, he has not made an endorsement in this race yet, though Trump has essentially said multiple times now he likes both Cornyn and Paxton and that they're both loyal and friendly to him in their own ways. So thus far, Trump has remained neutral in this Republican primary, though I would expect come primary day, Trump will likely make an endorsement and a decision in this race. But thus far, he has remained neutral. In the early polling thus far, despite Cornyn having a lot more endorsements from notable politicians and Ken Paxton has shown early on Ken Paxton with a pretty large lead over John Cornyn. Now, there is still about 15 to 20% undecideds or so, but Ken Paxton's been leading over John Cornyn for a while now, until about the month of August, where the four most recent polls show a lot more of a competitive race, with one poll showing a 5-point lead for Paxton, one showing a 1-point lead for Cornyn in the Emerson poll. Echelon Insights has Paxton up 5, and then Coefficient has Paxton up 3. So certainly narrowing up. Now, on the Democratic side, the only Democrat that's certainly, I would say, well known is the 2024 Democratic Texas nominee, former U.S. Representative Colin Allred. He is running again, and before Talarico entered this race, was looking to be the likely Democratic nominee. Two of the Democrats are running in Emily Morgul and Michael Swanson, who really don't have much of a chance in this primary. Another Democrat, Terry Virts, a media personality and retired astronaut, is also running, though given his name ID and popularity compared to Talarico and Allred, it's more likely than not Virts probably doesn't have much of a chance. But with James Talarico entering this race, this is a very competitive Democratic primary now underway. And this was something in videos I remember covering a few months ago now, Democrats in Texas were hoping to avoid, where they're hoping to run very competitive Democrats in every statewide office. There's U.S. Senate, there's governor, there's lieutenant governor, there's attorney general, there's secretary of state, there's really everything up. And Democrats were hoping for a sort of dream unity ticket where they could all run for one respected office and put up very formidable candidates in all of them. They're hoping to avoid competitive primaries. That does not seem to be the case now on the Senate side, where Colin Allred will be facing off against James Talarico. And this is going to be very interesting, because the early polling thus far of the Senate race shows Colin Allred clearly leading over all the other candidates, already breaking 50%. But in the hypothetical polling, where James Talarico's name is included, it's a lot more close. Public Policy Polling, which is a Democratic-affiliated pollster, shows Allred versus Talarico is an 8-point race. Allred at 40, Talarico 32, with still 27% of the vote undecided. An 8-point lead in a primary is honestly not that big of a lead compared to a general election. Primaries can be very hard to predict and can be very unpredictable, and this makes this race very competitive and very close. Though Allred does start out with a lead, that undecided vote will decide who ends up winning. The only other poll that featured Talarico versus Allred came from Texas Southern University, which also showed Allred leading 50 to 43. So with, again, 7% undecided. So thus far, based on the two polls we have to go off of, at least at this current point in time, even though Talarico is getting all this national praise and national attention, at least thus far, it looks like Colin Allred has a little bit of a slight lead in the Democratic primary to actually beat James Talarico in this primary. So we'll have to wait and see how that all shapes out. Now, whether it's Allred or Talarico advancing to the general election, they're going to be facing either John Cornyn or Ken Paxton. And thus far, it seems to be offering two very different possible general elections, where the early polling thus far does not really feature James Talarico for any of the polls, only Colin Allred at this point, but it shows that Ken Paxton seems to perform worse in the general election than John Cornyn does. Emerson College's most recent poll had Cornyn leading Allred by about 7 points, with 17% undecided. Now, for Paxton versus Allred, only a 5-point lead, 46-41. So at least for Colin Allred, the Democrats have a much better chance against Ken Paxton than they do against John Cornyn. And I bet when we get the first polls involving James Talarico in the general election, we're probably going to see similar numbers, where he'll be losing to John Cornyn probably by around 5 or 6 points, and we'll probably see him doing a point better or two against Ken Paxton. So we'll have to wait and see how that all goes. This is hypothetical for right now. Now, Texas's election history has been pretty interesting because at the presidential level, we just saw it go Republican for Donald Trump by 13.7% in 2024. The Senate level, we also just saw it vote for Ted Cruz by 8.5%, not as large as Trump's win, but still a likely Republican win, though under 10 points. But in 2020, John Cornyn won by 9.6%. 2018, Ted Cruz only won by 2.6% against Beto O'Rourke. So in the Democratic midterm environment, where everything went the Democrats' way, we saw Texas fall under 3 points in that very close race where Beto O'Rourke really became a national star for the Democrats. Could James Talarico potentially catch fire and become a national darling the same way Beto O'Rourke did and cause a very close Senate race in Texas in 2026? Given the right election environment, I think at the very least that possibility is out there. Now for Texas right now, I do still think it starts out as likely Republican, with in between a 5 and 15% margin of victory. But again, clarity in the Republican primary and James Talarico versus Colin Allred would also clear things up a lot in this race and potentially give us a better idea of how this race is shaping up. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Make sure to leave your thoughts and everything down in the comment section below. Also, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you never miss when I post a new video. Thank you so much for watching again, and I hope to see you in a future video.